Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited for today's session, Conflict Resolution for People Who Hate Conflict by Joshua Malden. Josh, thank you so much for spending your evening today, and really looking forward to this session. Before we dive in, I want to read your bio, which is very impressive. Joshua is Director of Design at RTM and an expert who speaks all over the world on conflict resolution. He's currently writing a book on the subject. He's also written and spoken extensively about design for Smashing Magazine, O'Reilly Media, and more. Joshua loves approaching design with as much curiosity and humanity as he can muster. Also, he's a big fan of dogs, cats too, but mostly dogs. He can be found online at joshuamalden.com. And we'll also have this information in the video, and we'll be recording this. Before I can talk anything more, I just want to say that everyone who's present here, please feel free to ask the questions. If you're not comfortable asking them directly, you can type it in the Zoom chat, and me and Janae, who's also helping me with the meetup, will be looking into this, and we'll try to ask them while we are in the topic, or we'll try to get answers from Josh at the end of the session. Josh, please take over.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. So I know that it's a smaller crowd tonight. If you just at any point want to unmute and ask me a question, feel free. I won't take offense to it. I want this to be as informal as a talk could be. So with that said, I am very pleased to be able to talk about my jam, which is conflict resolution, especially if you're the kind of person who hates it, like I was. So I have this broken down into a few sections here. It looks like we've got a little... Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So we're going to break this down into 4 big sections. One is about just getting yourself prepared for these conversations. The second one is about having them. Third, sometimes things get a little weird in these kinds of conversations, so we want to figure out how we can actually make those better. And then we can dive into some tricky situations. I would call out that this is something that you can use when you're talking one-on-one to someone, if you happen to be in a group, and even the risky one, which is your boss or someone above you. I don't know if you remember seeing this meme a few years ago, but it's precious to me because it perfectly represents how I used to see myself with conflict. Like, the whole thing that started me down this path was I was dropped into a consulting situation where I had to manage a product manager who was doing a situation in which the project manager was doing their own thing, in contrary to what the client wanted, an engineer who was just treating what we were doing with the client as just a suggestion and building their own UI. And I just went home feeling terrible because this conflict and trying to navigate it was having like physical effects on me. And so I thought, I need to do something about this, if not for myself, for the team and the project. And then after probably a few months of getting some mentoring, some training, doing a lot of research, I cobbled together this framework that has really worked well for me. And I've helped other people put this to use, and it's been really helpful in all kinds of situations. So I went from being one of those folks that just did not want to rock the boat, didn't want to engage in any conversation that was even a little tense. I preferred to seethe silently, as some do. But this is the core belief that I ended up coming away with. And it's that if we can embrace healthy conflict, we're better, our teams are better, and our products are better. I think it's the key to building better products and there are lots of sources, like even the Harvard Business Review. They have a solid study on the highest performing teams thrive on conflict. And to be clear, what I mean by conflict is the healthy kind. I'm not talking about yelling. I'm not talking about things like that. It's just embracing disagreements and different ways of seeing things. And my sole goal for this is to give you some tools that you can use in your next tough conversation to help you shift away from the anti-conflict side of things to the pro-resolution side of things. And I want to ask a question to the group, like, what's the hardest thing about these conversations for you?
I can share mine because I've had
Sure.
some.
Yeah, go for it.
The hardest thing about having hard conversation is because I think we all try not to enter conflict, but with my experiences that I've always had people who strongly believe in that they are right. So, it's really hard to break that because usually you can only have conversation with people who are equally, are willing to embrace a healthy, conversation. But the time it happens is with people, I don't know if difficult people is the right word, but people, they're not open, they don't want to talk about it, or they just think that's their way and they're not willing to compromise. And that's where I've had like really hard time getting through that.
So folks who don't want to work things out.
Yeah.
Okay.
They just believe they're right, and then that's how it should be done.
Yeah. Been there.
For me, if I can jump in, my name is Ivana. I'm from Montreal.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for doing this. This is like the most difficult thing in my life, I think I can say. So my personal issue with facing conflict is that it always feels like there is some kind of immortal danger. And I suspect that I have some kind of an emotional conditioning, probably from my early years, that create a very strong emotional response where I just, despite my best resolve, I just lose self-control, and it just becomes this, sheer terror and panic. And the best idea that I have is to run away, even though I know it's not the right thing to do. So the sense that the world is ending at the slightest conflict. So I'm just known for avoiding any tension whatsoever. But that actually brings conflict to me somehow. I think maybe people see that they can, so they do.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. And I don't think that you're alone in this. I've had people share similar sentiments to the point where it drove me to dig into more of the neuroscience aspect of how we view conflict. And so like the next thing is really, I think, a good visual representation of what you were talking about. So, starting out, when we were still hunter-gatherers before civilization really began, we had these really finely developed senses. And, if we sensed that we were in danger, it would invoke our stress response. It's just like, we would think anything is like a tiger that's coming to eat us, or a stranger that's coming to take our food. That was incredibly helpful for our survival as humans. But given that we're 10,000 years past when this happened, our brains haven't really caught up. So it gets kind of weird. And I kind of look at that as more of a design flaw of the brain. But there are some ways that we can hack around it. And I hope that you'll find a few of these things useful. So while it's kind of tempting to think of our brain as just like one singular entity, It's more akin to an umbrella that houses a few related means of processing the world around us. For our purposes, and with apologies to any neuroscience nerds out there, we're just going to break this down into three main sections: the neocortex, the limbic brain, and the reptilian brain. The neocortex, which is sometimes called the primate brain, that's what's responsible for all of our logical thinking, our rational thinking. If you want a pop culture reference, it's a little like Mr. Spock on the Star Trek series. It's really good at abstract thinking and language and imagination. The next level down is the limbic or mammalian brain. That's where all of our emotions, our memories live, and it handles other like automatic things. But the limbic brain is where a really important part of the brain lives, and it's our amygdalas. And we have two, one behind each eye and not optical nerve. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it calls them the brain's smoke detectors. And I really think that's a perfect metaphor for it, because if it senses danger, it sounds an alarm. And basically it shuts off blood flow to the logical part of your brain. And it tends to engage the reptilian brain. So this is a little like the Hulk from the Avengers. Its sole purpose is aggression, fight, flight, or freeze instincts. So yeah, when we see something that's potentially triggering our amygdalas, or just going to shut down the blood flow to parts of our brain and send some cortisol, the stress hormone, through our system so that we can be ready to fight, flight, or go hide somewhere. So this is essentially what you turn into when you sense some conflict. Some people are aggressive, some people are aversive. So with that out of the way, I want to shift gears for a moment and introduce how these effective conversations are going to be structured. And we'll walk through each of these individually. At the bottom of this, the things that should underpin all of our conversations is psychological safety. And like, you can't really have a solid conversation without it. And every conversation that you have, the details are going to be unique, but the overall structure for these things is pretty universal. So yeah, if we're digging into psychological safety, that's really important, just to be able to be open and vulnerable with people and just know that you're there to work it out, to what you were saying earlier, Anita. On top of that, we're going to start with the facts. Like, these are the objective, observable things that happened. On top of that are the conclusions that we draw from those facts. So if you see something, here's what it made you feel, here's how it impacted your team. And because this is not a monologue, you got to open it up to other people. And so we'll go through each of these sections and talk about ways that we can do these things. I've seen it apply to teammates with, hygiene issues. You've got people who aren't honoring their commitments, people who are stakeholders who are changing their mind at the last minute, and it's wreaking havoc on morale and the budget. These things are really, really helpful here. And so I kind of like that first question I was asking you. We were talking about, like, how does this stuff kind of make you feel? But I'd kind of like to tweak it a little bit, since it's a smaller group, and just ask, like, what's coming up for you right now as we talk about these things? Like, do you feel like this is starting to give you some foundations for having a conversation? Everything landing okay for you? I will take the silence as a yes.
Yes.
So let's dig into preparing for the conversation. So we've got a ton of examples that we can talk through. I'd love it if anyone throughout the course of this conversation has one that they want to share. Please feel welcome to. I realize that we're recording, so if you want to ask to pause the recording, that's something we can do. If you want to hang on till later, we can also do that. But the first thing for preparing for a conversation is just to check in with yourself. How are you feeling? How are you doing? Are you channeling your inner ice cube and checking yourself before you wreck yourself? There are a few ways of actually doing that, and one of them is called Harlans Razor. It's an aphorism that really helps declaw a lot of the stories that we tend to tell ourselves about other people, like the world is ending, people are out to get me. Basically, like, let's try not to assume bad intentions over something that we could just ascribe to a misunderstanding, an oversight, some kind of neglect, because this really keeps everything human. And I also want to just take a second and talk about how important it is to differentiate the behavior that happened from the impact it had. For example, if we're in a room together and I get mad and storm out of the room and I stomp on your foot, even if I didn't mean to, that's still going to hurt. And stuff that happens at work, behaviors like this aren't any different. So yeah, we wanted to talk a bit about, like, checking yourself before you wreck yourself with the Harlans Razor, but I think it's also important to recognize what our intentions are for having this conversation. There was a very big car startup, and I heard a story from someone who worked there, from a manager who said that, I just love it when a manager calls someone out in front of the entire group. It feels like something out of Succession. If your intent is to just shut someone down publicly, probably not a good idea to have these conversations. And sometimes we like to think that we don't have anything to do with an event turning out the way it did, but realistically, we usually play some part, and being honest with yourself helps you ensure that you're owning whatever part of the situation you're in. Of course, this does not apply if you're dealing with things like harassment or abuse. You're not responsible for someone else's actions there. I hope that was obvious, but if not, I'm gonna make it very obvious. The first really big tool that we have here is just the sliding scale of how much you care about this kind of thing. I've used this many times in the past, and it's an extremely effective tool. I've asked it to myself. I've asked it to the person that I'm having this conflict with. Like, how are you feeling about this? Like, is this like 1 to 10? You're like, are you like a 10, an 8? I usually tend to ask myself these things, and if it doesn't really bother me, or it's not a cumulative kind of thing, I really just let it slide so that I can focus on the things that matter most. And then if it does matter to me, I can jump in and really, really dig into the subject with someone. There's another tool that I use. There are a lot of variables that go into whether or not you should have a conversation, but basically you start in the upper left. Like, are you going to be able to continue your work? No, you should probably talk to them. I won't walk through everything here, but I do want to call out that you want to consider your and their mental state. Is their workload healthy or unhealthy? Like, is this like a conversation you're trying to have at like Friday at 5? Maybe everyone's kind of fried out from the week. These are some good rules of thumb to really go through here. And moving on to getting the facts, this again is like what actually happened. So like if a security camera were to look down on you and this other person, what would it observe? What would it see? And like, I really like to write things down. It's one of the best ways for me to process things. Your mileage may vary, but I like to write down everything that happened in a scenario, and I write down the things that are distinctly observable and factual, and then I'll also write down like how those things impacted me. These are the things that are going to form the basis for my conversation with someone else. And while I'm doing this, I also want to take a moment and think about, is this just like a one-off situation, or does this happen a lot with this person? And I'm finding that if I have evidence of a pattern, it makes for a much stronger argument. Because if it's a one-off, those things are very easy to blow off. I was an art major, so I was very, very good at brushing off one-off criticisms. And I've known a lot of other people who can do that as well. So I'll give you a brief exercise here, and I'll give you a moment to read it. What I'd like for you to do is to read it and think about what is actually a fact from this. And I'm going to take a big sip of water while you do it, and I'll come back in a second. Okay. So if I'm separating all of the opinions from the facts, this is what I'm left with. My teammate committed us to a design that I didn't make twice. They've scheduled 3 meetings without consulting me. This actually happened. And I'll give you one other example. So it's probably worth calling out that if you're going into a conversation naming names and saying, you know, you are an asshole for doing something, the other person is immediately going to seize up, and they're not going to hear anything past when you said the word asshole. So with that said, here's what it looks like. You talked over me 3 times in that meeting. When I started talking, you looked away. And this is a pretty important aspect of just capturing what actually happened. And so now we can get into forming some conclusions. And, you know, in my day job, I help people build software. And one of the things that we want to do is really just like get down to the impact of things. You know, how do these facts make you feel? How did it impact your team? How did it impact your product? I tend to use this a lot. You know, when you blah, 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 maybe when you talk over me 3 times, I feel like I'm being undermined. It's sort of like a light version of like this idea of what's called nonviolent communication, where you're forming your conversation in terms of like how you saw it, how it impacted you, and it's less accusatory, which is where the nonviolent term comes from here. I also like to have this as a preparation tool where I just sit down and think about like, what are all the negative things that someone can say about me here? Are they going to say that I'm being pushy? Are they going to say that I'm not sensitive to their needs? And this really serves a few purposes. 1, it can help you further craft your conversation, but 2, it puts you in their shoes. Like, what might they have seen? What might have been going on in their head? And you can kind of avoid a lot of really awkward moments in these conversations by just doing this little bit of thinking ahead of time. Another way of doing this is saying, like, how would they say that I'm contributing to this situation? And lastly, we're going to set some goals. And again, because I like to write things down, I write down the things that I want to get out of this conversation with someone, whether it's like, I want them to keep their word so that our client doesn't lose trust in us. This is like, I take it out of my little notebook, I put it in my pocket. And if things ever get kind of weird or go sideways in a conversation, like I have this like physical reminder of something in my pocket or in my hand that I can remember, like, oh, this is why I'm here. And like, I can redirect the conversation so that I can make sure that I'm getting the thing that I need. And we'll talk about getting what the other person needs in a moment. So let's talk about actually going and having this conversation. So we're going to, again, walk right back up this pyramid. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with safety. And again, psychological safety is that shared belief that it's okay to be vulnerable with one another. You don't always have this in conversations. Sometimes you need to have a conversation. Feelings of safety be damned. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with Google Slides, by the way. But I like to start these conversations by asking for permission to have it. And I like to have them start with, like, I want to ask a question to which they respond, no. Is this a bad time? Are you super busy? I've noticed some things that I could really use your input on. And it's a really small way to communicate to the other person that you aren't just here to unload on them and that you really want to have a productive conversation. And it really also helps them feel safe in talking because they're buying into this conversation. We've all had these moments where people ask us like, hey, do you have a minute? Or can I bother you real quick? And then it's like 30 minutes later and you have a billion other things that you need to be doing. So yeah, this helps avoid those begrudging and, obliging yeses. And I also really like to call out that it's a good idea to be conscious of what's going on with your body language and emotional contagions. And, I realize that because we're living through a pandemic, the word contagion probably has a slightly different context than it used to. But it also can be a good thing. Happiness can be contagious. So again, like, some people are really susceptible to contagions like anger, or sadness, or frustration, or anxiety. And it's good to be aware of the things that you tend to be most sensitive to so that you can guide your conversation and make sure that you feel safe. And there's also the body language, like both, like, what are they doing? What is their body language like? And like, what language are you giving off with your body? I'm not saying that we walk around like robots with our hands at our sides, only that we should be aware that this is what we as humans have evolved to pick up on over the last several millennia. And realize that just like deep down, you know what's best. Like if this doesn't feel safe, if it doesn't feel like it's going to be a good conversation, it might not be. And this is just a reminder to listen to yourself. And so once you've asked someone like, hey, are you busy? I could really use some input from you on this. And now we get to like pull out those facts that we wrote down. And I look at these like, this is the basis for my conclusions. This is my math homework. I'm showing my work on the problem here. Like, this is what led me to this outcome. And if you start with the facts, it's easier to keep people engaged. They're less inclined to get defensive because you may have just missed a fact. You may have missed something. And so starting with that is a really good deterrent. So when you share these facts, like, hey, you committed us to this design that we didn't make and we didn't test, you share your conclusions. And we talk about, how these facts affected us or the conclusions that we drew. And I really tend to speak more tentatively about these things because it's a signal that there's still something that I might have missed. I haven't finalized any kind of judgment or evaluation about this. And so using terms like it seems like, it feels like, it looks like, it again signals to the other person that it's like, I haven't fully landed on this yet, and I'm still open to having a conversation about it. And again, these things aren't monologues, so you want to open it up and get input from other people. And here are several good questions and not so good questions. I've seen all of these used, and we'll dig into these here in just a second. The reason why I'm preferring to use these open-ended questions is it invites more discussion. The closed questions invite confirmation, or sometimes they can be used to trap people into something. Like, we've all had those telemarketers that have managed to get through to us who will just ask us a billion questions that all end with yes, so that they're like, oh yeah, do you want to buy this thing? And the hope is that you'll say yes. It's a weird manipulation technique. But these open-ended questions, like, I really prefer to start with things that use what and how. You might in your brain just think like, why don't I just ask why? And it turns out that why is a defensive trigger. It's people tend to feel more attacked when you use those terms. So like, what and how really kind of get you to the same point, but it keeps that logical part of people's brains engaged. And because we're really trying to get down to the bottom of this with someone else, like, can you help me understand this? Like, what am I missing? These are going to really open up your conversation. And these others, the closed ones, sometimes it can come across as condescending. It can come across as like you're not really listening. So I really tend to avoid them. And the next neat little trick that I like to use is called mirroring, and it's a refined approach to active listening. So, people tend to nod and say it, like when you're talking, just to show that they're engaged, but we're going to take that to another level. And what mirroring is like, you're basically repeating the last word or like important phrase in their sentence to signal to the other person that, one, you're listening to them because you're using their words to communicate back to them. And it also helps dig in to get any kind of other context. Sometimes people say things that aren't very clear, and like putting those terms back to them can really help get to the bottom of things. Like, I've used this before where someone, after me telling them that, you committed us to this design that we didn't actually make and test, the response that I got was, I just wish you weren't such a diva about these things. We're just trying to get stuff done, and this is how we've always done it. What I could do in this case and what it would look like is, it seems like there's a lot going on with like, it's always been this way, and there's a lot wrapped up in the like part where I was called a diva. So I would say like, it's always been this way, and just let it hang. Like, count to 4 before you try and fill that silence, just so that you can give them a moment to give you a little more clarity. And there's a similar version of this where you're summarizing what someone has said. So again, when you're saying like, hey, I wish you wouldn't be such a diva about these things, a label would be, okay, it seems like your priority is to do things the way it's always been done because you know that. And even if that comes at the expense of the product. And again, it shows that you're listening because you're summarizing the things that they said and you're still able to drive the conversation forward. And the other tool that I have here is called probing. And I use this all the time when I'm working with clients. I've used it in my personal life when people give very vague feedback or requests or, just general human things. This helps us really gain some clarity about what someone is asking. And I use this like framework from Asana, and they have broken it down into do, try, and consider. I've found that when people give feedback, and sometimes it can be a little stressful to hear, or if someone is wanting like a new set of features, or like, what if we made the logo red? Sometimes people are just talking, but because of their position or our relationship to them, we tend to think like, oh, this person said this, and so now I actually have to go do it. Sometimes it's going to be the case, but more times than you think, you could ask them like, hey, is this like a mandatory have to do kind of thing, like something you want us to experiment with, or just something you want us to think about? And a lot of times it's just a consideration. And here's what that looks like if you feel like taking a screenshot of it. And so when you're having these conversations, a lot of this has been focused on like, how do you prepare for it? Like, what do you want going into it? But sometimes these things happen and people just come to you. This is especially true if you manage people. Sometimes people come to you and things are on fire. So one, obviously, don't ever tell anyone to calm down. We all know this is not a good thing. It doesn't go anywhere good because you're invalidating someone's emotional experiences. It's really good to use mirrors and labels because that's going to immediately help people get into the logical part of their brain and start clarifying things and giving you more context. If this is something that's like a person-to-person issue, like you have an issue with them or they have an issue with you, bring out that sliding scale. And sometimes people just ask you the most ludicrous things. I once had someone who was a client and they said that instead of the 3 months that they had for us to design an app, they're like, okay, you have to do it in 3 days. And I asked them, how am I supposed to do that? And sometimes when you push this question back to them, it makes them realize that like, oh, actually, this isn't very realistic. They could very well tell you, I don't care, it's your job, figure it out. There are other ways of dealing with that too, but 9 times out of 10, it really helps you get to the bottom of like what someone actually needs. So the next step before we get into any kind of tricky situations is just the disaster recovery. Like sometimes it gets weird. What do you do? And I'm kind of curious about, where do you see these conversations having gone wrong for you? For me, it's been a lot of like, I've gotten too in my head about something and like I've really formed this like concrete story that this person is not good at their job, or this person is not being empathetic and like not seeing something from someone else's point of view. And that's caused me to get a little prickly in conversations. I don't know if that's happened to anyone else, but that's certainly one thing.
I think I realized after I looked at the open-ended and the closed conversation slide, I think that resonated with me, Josh, where, I think the way probably I expressed my, how I was feeling was more about more closed conversations, trying to, maybe because I was trying to be defensive and not letting them to explain themselves. And I think that's where I think I had problems in the past. But that's a good takeaway for me, like being careful with the language. I think it was more to do with, putting them on the spot, and then they feel a little threatened, or they feel like, they tend to become defensive, and they only focus on the things that I said wrong, as opposed to having a healthy conversation.
Yeah. Oh, wow. There's a whole lot to unpack with that one. We'll save some of that for later, because I think it'll come up in the tricky situations section. So here's how it goes down when things start to get weird. The first thing you want to do is a safety check. Like, check in with yourself. How are you feeling? You got some adrenaline pumping, some cortisol going through the veins, some shallow breathing, some shaky hands. There's a spectrum of behavior that we can tell if someone is about to be way more aggressive because they're feeling unsafe, or like someone is just like really withdrawing. You've got people who just will give you like extremely terse responses. But there's also the people who yell or raise their voice. I was one of those folks before I started having these conversations that I would just like cross my arms, maybe have a little bit of a shaky hand, and I just wouldn't want to be there and have this conversation. And, a good example of this is I was in a retro with someone where we were talking about like a small CSS issue that we needed to solve. I worked at a place where they like pointed these things. So this was like the lowest possible effort that you could do. And it got fixed in 5 minutes with just a couple lines of code. But one of the engineers decided that they wanted to spend the next 7 hours and 55 minutes trying to do it a different way. And then they punted and said, this thing can't be done. When that came up in retro, this person was scowling, crossing their arms, tilting their chin in, and just saying like, no one ever listens to me. The CSS is garbage. And it's pretty clear this person was not feeling safe. We did end up getting to the bottom of it as a group. But yeah, just be on the lookout for these things. And hands down, the best tool to use when you see that things are getting a little funny is called a contrasting statements. And I find that most people become really angry because they're missing the point, or there's something they're not seeing, or they feel like there's something that we're not acknowledging. And this contrast statement is a really good way of getting it back on track, where it's like, I'm not saying you're bad at your job. I'm saying I need you to work with me before making decisions that affect the design of something, for example. Or like, I'm not saying that you don't care about doing good work. I'm saying that I need to have agency in how I do it. Something like that. And then I think about this idea of shared purpose, because again, most of the time we want the same thing. We just kind of get in each other's way. And it's a little like the old Ghostbusters movie. And there's a scene where people are like trying to capture this ghost, and there was a directive of like, hey, these little beams from our like guns or proton packs, or sorry, I can't quite remember what they are now.
I like
But
the analogy though, it's funny.
so the idea is like, if you cross the streams, stuff gets really weird, things blow up, it's not good. And it's just the perfect metaphor for this situation. Because like we all want to capture this ghost, but sometimes we just kind of get in each other's way. And if we can just like work together and find a shared purpose, we can get the ghost. So again, like, just remind yourself that any other person that, you know, we usually all want the same thing, just their definitions of good might differ. And, you know, like for a designer, good could look like, hey, a user can actually complete this workflow. For a product manager, it could be that we're delivering the right amount of value for the story. We are achieving the product market fit that we're looking for. And an engineer could mean that their tests pass. Sometimes these things conflict, and establishing what's good for you and what's good for them helps you find that common ground to move forward together. And if you need to, there are some questions you can ask them, like, how does this fit into our objective? Like, let's talk about the core issue. There seems like there's something underneath this. Let's explore that a little bit. Or like, what's the end goal here? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? Because 9 times out of 10, when you're doing this, people jump to one solution because that's the thing that they imagined. And because they're probably in a hurry or don't want to spend more time on it, they just lock into those things. But if you can pull them back and say, all right, what are you trying to accomplish here? Because there might be a way of getting you what you need without hurting me, this team, this other thing, or, you know, that I can also get the thing that I need. And lastly, let's talk about hitting the eject button, because there's no reason to stay in all conversations. Like sometimes people just dig their heels in. And I think that just knowing that things could reach an impasse, it really reduces your stress. Like you don't have to go in and solve these things immediately. I really tend to look at this like gardening. Like we're just making sure that the soil is fertile. Sometimes these things will pop up again, and like people will be in a different space, or they'll realize they can have these conversations with you. It's also just okay to walk away. Like you should not feel like you have to stay in a conversation where someone's yelling at you, degrading you. Like just get out. I've got like a neat little tricky situation where something like this happens, and we can talk about that. But sometimes like part of pulling back, especially if you manage people or direct people, sometimes you just have to give them a tough message. And it's like, I don't like doing that. Nobody likes doing it. Nobody likes getting them. But you know, if you do have to deliver a tough message to someone who's underperforming or someone who's not holding up their end of the deal, go in, say, hey, we talked about this previously. It's happened twice since. You have to do things A, B, and C, or this could lead to a performance improvement plan or reassignment or something like that. And just like lay out the stakes. Sometimes people really won't get it until you're that blunt with them. So let's talk about some tricky situations. Before I dive in to the ones that I have, I'm kind of curious, like, is there something that's on anyone's mind that like is a kind of a tricky situation that they might want help navigating, or something that they've seen that was kind of a weird thing that they wish could get resolved?
Mine have been in the past. I don't have anything current, but
Oh, sure. Yeah, past stuff is totally fine.
it was, I think it was because I was a contractor. And so, already it kind of, yeah. So I think that was one of my situations where I was, I think the expectations were, I don't know, there was definitely situation where as a contractor, you're not supposed to present certain things or it because of the proprietary or yeah. But I mean, there are a lot of interesting situations. I'm just trying to see if I can't really think of a specific example, but at a generic view, it was mostly um, not letting me, I always had a question like, if you hire someone for the job, then they wouldn't really let you do the job because, a lot of they have their own beliefs as to how it should be done. But I always had questions like, if you hire someone to do the job, you should let them do the job.
Right. Okay. Yeah, those can be some really tough conversations to have. I would love to talk about a few and then just leave the rest of the time open for questions. This is a thing that comes up the most often. People want to know how to have conversations with those who are above them. These things can be really tricky and delicate because it could be a career limiting move, as some say. But if this is something that you can become comfortable with, like, it's an amazing skill to cultivate. And really, there are a few things that you need to keep in mind. One is do your best to establish safety. And that means just like showing that you have respect for them in their position, that you might not see the whole picture. The way that our conversations are structured, it's going to have that stuff built in. And a little extra safety to say like, all right, cool. I'm just here to get to the bottom of this. I don't have an agenda here. And so when you do this, let's say that your boss keeps changing their mind when you present something to them and it's like it's wasting your time, it's costing your client or company a lot of money, and it's delaying you getting things out to market. You could approach and mention that you've got some ideas on how to make this process more reliable and efficient, and that it could save a few $1,000s each week. And then you toss over to them, see if they can figure out a way forward together. But as someone who is a consultant in their day-to-day life, sometimes really all you can do is just share a fact with someone, let them do with it what they will. There's a Zen practice called compassionate detachment, which once I learned how to cultivate that in myself, it really made consulting and just like being in tricky situations a whole lot easier, because with that, I'm able to fully advocate for what I think is the right thing. Like if it's in something we design, if it's in something that we ship, these are the things that we think are going to be best. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't often have full control over the end outcome of something. And so just if I see that we're going to go over a cliff, I'm going to say, you're going to go over a cliff over here. So maybe don't. I've done this a few times. CEOs, other high-powered folks, and I'm still alive to tell you this story. So it works out. So sometimes we have folks who really like to interrupt. If you find yourself getting flustered because someone is interrupting you, you can use things like, I think that in the 2020 election cycle, I don't know if that's too triggering to talk about. It was a weird time. But Kamala Harris ended up, when she was getting interrupted, as people often do in debates, she just said, "I'm talking." And it's great. And some people are able to just like keep going despite the fact that they've been interrupted. We see this happening a lot on Zoom, especially since we're more remote these days. You've got like delays in communication and like internet lag. So sometimes we often talk over each other without meaning to. We touched on this just a moment or two ago, but if you're in a conversation where someone is yelling, obviously it's totally fine to leave. You should not feel like you have to stay. But if you do want to stay, there's some really good things that you can do beforehand. And, I just lump it under hacking your amygdala. You've got this statement that's like ready to go, just pull it off the shelf and use it. Like, if someone's yelling at you, we can't talk till you lower your voice, or I don't engage in conversations where people yell. Let's talk later. And it's a really good way of getting in front of your amygdala, as it's sounding the alarm. That you can say this thing that can help you get out of the conversation, or can help you like lower the temperature a little bit. And I'll make this the last one that I talk about. We are mostly remote these days. And if at all possible, try to do these conversations in real time. Like if you can meet in person, amazing. Like you get the full fidelity. Like you get body language, you get the full range of my voice. Like Zoom will compress our audio and our voices so that we still aren't getting the full effect of someone. But turn on your camera if you can. If that's not an option, you don't feel comfortable, audio is an acceptable fallback. You do tend to you lose the nonverbal communication part of things, which is a pretty significant part of how we communicate with each other. I try to avoid email mostly because things are so prone to misinterpretation when there's none of this other fidelity to support what we're talking about. For example, I could send you an email that reads as innocuous to one person, but to another person who maybe didn't sleep well, isn't feeling great, having a bad morning, it could read as kind of like hostile or terse or something, something negative, because our brains have evolved to fill in the gaps that we have with negative things. Again, great for our survival 10,000 years ago. Not so good these days. But, if you do need to go to text, whether it's email or Slack or text messages, work a little harder to make sure that you're being as clear as you can. I have seen studies that support this, and I fully recommend doing it. Toss an emoji or two in there, if you think that someone might be prone to misunderstanding. Don't be afraid to use those, because our brain registers those emoji and the little smiley face emoticons the same way that we would if we were seeing one another in person and I smiled. It's kind of fascinating to think about, but don't be afraid of using emoji. So with that said, I'll show you some helpful resources, and then I'll just open it up for questions. Some of these techniques were from Never Split the Difference. I adapted the mirroring technique from there. If you want to dig into something that's a little more applicable to both corporate and everyday life, Crucial Conversations is a really solid starter. I will warn you, it's a bit dry. I've also found some people really love Radical Candor. I think overall it's a solid book. Sometimes I worry that it enables people to be jerks, but I think if you came to this talk, you'll probably be able to pick out those parts. And then lastly, it's called How to Have a Good Day. And this book is fantastic for a number of reasons, because it helps you have this discovery mindset so that you can approach these conversations that are tough with a mindset of like, what can I learn here? How can we figure this out together? I'm glad that I get to have this conversation with them, even though it's tense. And just like, you would be floored to learn how much it helps to have that discovery mindset. There was a study at the University of Rochester where students framed their like test score goals positively, like, I'm going to do my best to earn an A. And the other half are like, I don't want to fail. What ended up happening was the people who framed this more positively did 50% better than the people who framed it negatively. There's a whole lot of stuff that's wrapped up in that. Sometimes you do need to be realistic. Like, this can get into like toxic positivity, which is definitely not healthy, but just having the mindset of like, okay, what can I learn? How can we figure this out together? It makes all these conversations way better. And there's also a neat little cheat sheet that I have for you. It's got like, hey, what happened? How did it make me feel? What are my goals for this conversation? And it just helps you plan out your next tough convo with someone. So if there's a question that you have, like, feel free to jump in and ask. I know I've talked for a lot. So what's on your mind? How is this landing? Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Josh. I can't say enough. I think I'll rewatch this video. I did try to make some quick notes, but a lot of helpful tips. Definitely the conversation part, the probing part is a great takeaway for me.
Thank you.
Anyone else has questions? Or anything you want to say?
Well, I'll go if anyone wants a moment to compose their thoughts. I again just want to say thanks for having me. I hope that you found at least like one thing to take into your next tough convo. If you want to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn with a question, I hold office hours, so you can write me. You can jump on a Zoom with me. I'll keep all these things confidential, but I wanted to extend that as well. Just find me on LinkedIn and send me a note and we'll figure it out.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. That's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.